Hello again, and happy last Tuesday, Philippine time of 2020. It's still, of course, Monday in the United States, or in the two contiguous parts of the United States, especially. So I'm going to read summarizingly and then comment on an article published by the Washington Post on December the 29th, 2020, of the profound divides which exist in the United States as this year comes to an end, and which definitely will be major challenges for the US President-elect Joe Biden as he prepares to take office on January the 20th, 2021. Of course, the United States has often in its history been divided. In its early years in the late 18th century, and even for a portion of the early 19th century, there was a division between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, who then developed into Democratic Republicans and Democrats, for example, about the westward expansion. And then, well into the 19th century, actually until the 1860s, there was division on slavery. So whether it was morally evil, and therefore it should have been abolished everywhere, not only in the North, but also in the South. And it should not have been extended into the Western territories of the United States. That kept growing, and gradually those Western territories became states as the population grew, especially the white settlers' population. And then after that issue was resolved, unfortunately, through the bloody Civil War in the early and mid 1860s, then, for example, the industrializations and urbanizations effects, which were by no means always positive for all people. What to do to the growing immigrant population, because in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially before the First World War broke out in 1914, millions and millions of immigrants flocked to the United States, especially, although not entirely exclusively, from Europe, and brought their cultures and languages and religions with them, although, of course, as far as the religions were concerned, many of them found co-religionists already in the United States. And then the women's suffragist movement and women's equality movement, so that women should be given the right to vote, as happened in various states already before federally that became the law through a constitutional amendment in 1920. And then to what extent the United States should divide the bounty of its labor to those who were less fortunate. The United States started slowly to move towards a welfare state, or the welfare state, during the New Deal years of the 1930s and early 1940s. And then Franklin Roosevelt died and was succeeded by his third vice president, Harry Truman, who introduced the so-called Fair Deal. But that made relatively little progress in the US Congress, even after his stunning election victory in 1948, because there were enough conservative Democrats and Republicans to block it. And then Truman was succeeded by Dwight Eisenhower, who, although he was a Republican, he was moderate enough to realize that the Social Security and therefore the welfare state should be gradually increased. And since he was by nature a reconciler rather than a strongly ideological person, a strongly confrontational person, therefore he was patient to work at these reforms piecemeal, one by one, instead of trying to make huge strides in a short period of time. In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights of ethno-racial minorities especially but not exclusively the African Americans, because also to a smaller extent the Native Americans and Hispanic Americans started to demonstrate for their rights, and rightly so. That also divided the United States not only north versus south, but even in the north there were various suburbs where many white Americans thought that the civil rights movement should have been content with slower and more gradual changes, and they thought that the US Supreme Court ordered busing of students to create more racially balanced schools was both unconstitutional and unnecessary and too hasty. And then starting in the 1960s, there has been this cultural, religious slash spiritual and lifestyle divide between the liberal and libertarian Americans on the one hand and the moderate and especially the traditional and conservative Americans and religious Americans on the other hand. And we have to, of course, remember that there are those Americans who are in the middle, like elsewhere in the world. It isn't only between the liberals and libertarians and secularists on the one hand, and the conservatives, traditionalists, and religious people on the other hand. There are in the middle those moderates who are to some extent liberal or even libertarian. To some extent, they have also conservative, traditionalist, or even religious values and views. For example, there are millions of Americans who, perhaps even tens of millions, who are basically pro-life on abortion. So they believe that at least in most cases, the unborn should live. They only basically support abortion in the cases of medical emergencies. And they also would prefer, if it was possible to do that through peaceful and democratic means, the restoration of the traditional heterosexual definition of marriage. However, they believe that the United States should, if and when it gets rid of its huge deficit, extend health insurance to more people, eventually to all of its legal residents. They also believe that the US tax system should become more progressive and should reward the working poor more. They also believe that the United States should take the environmental and climate crises more seriously. They believe that all forms of racism and ethnic and racial discrimination should be outlawed. And while they don't favor same-sex marriages, they believe that there should be no systematic intimidation, let alone any violence, physical violence, perpetrated against the sexual minorities. No defamation of them publicly, even online. And they believe that the online bullies should be published, the online bullies should be punished severely. Okay, let's go to the article. So after a year of pandemic and protest and the big election, America, meaning the United States, is as divided as ever. Trump will leave office and Biden will become president, but the two Americas, of course, the reality is more complicated than that, remain far apart and deeply distrustful of the values and beliefs of the other. By Dan Balz, or Balz, however it should be pronounced, B-A-L-Z, December the 27th, 2020. Okay, so I stand corrected. I thought it would have been published on December the 29th. The year 2020 brought extraordinary and unexpected challenges, of course, to the entire world, we can say, that tested the strength of basic institutions, demanded courage and sacrifice in the face of a raging pandemic, because 5 out of the 6 continents of the world have been hit hard. The only continent that hasn't been hit hard has been Oceania in the South Pacific. Underscored racial and economic inequities and produced the biggest turnout of voters in the history of US elections. In the end, America was as divided as ever. The election itself resulted in significant change, or no change. President Trump is on his way out of office after a single tumultuous term to be replaced on January the 20th, 2021 by President-elect Joe Biden. Turnover in the most important of all elected offices, an office that was the major focus of the election after all, because the United States is a presidential democracy, where the president is both the head of state and the head of government. Will bring a new tone, new faces, and new initiatives to Washington and the country. But it was Trump, not Biden, who seemed to have the longer coattails. As a result, Biden will start his term with the smallest House of Representatives majority the Democrats have had in nearly a century and a half. And unless Democrats win both of the Georgia runoff elections, which in my opinion is unlikely, on January the 5th, 2021, he also will be the first newly elected Democratic president without a Senate majority since the election of 1884, when guess who, Grover Cleveland, won. And then Cleveland lost in 1888, but came back to serve another term in 1892. And that is something Trump is hoping for, but I honestly do not believe that enough Republicans want to have a presidential candidate who will only accept the election results without court challenges unless he wins. Trump has been the most polarizing of all US presidents, or at least one of the most polarizing ones, certainly, and probably the most polarizing US president after the Second World War. With a style designed to divide, inflame, and impound, he has accepted no responsibility for things that have gone wrong, at least mostly that is true, preferring to blame others or to pretend nothing went wrong. Even now, he seeks to overturn the November results. Biden's victory would seem to signal a hunger for something different, something calmer, some change in direction. But elections are about more than the race for the White House. The 2020 campaign was a victory for Biden and a defeat for Trump. But for both the Democrats and the Republicans and the ideas they espouse, it was neither. Instead, it marked a continuation of a long struggle for power that has been fought out for more than a decade without a clear resolution. And we could even say, ever since the 1992 US presidential elections, when the incumbent president and Republican presidential candidate, George Bush Sr., lost the election to Democrat Bill Clinton. However, because of the strong third-party candidacy of the late Ross Perot, Clinton could not win a majority of the popular vote. And neither could he in 1996, although he came within less than 1%. Incidentally, Perot was also then on the ballot. Clinton also tried major reforms such as the federally guaranteed health insurance, but especially that one failed. And he had to, for 6 of his 8 presidential years, contend with Republican majorities in both houses of Congress. And then he had in his second term that impeachment trial, which of course left the United States also rather divided. Biden's victory in the popular vote was impressive. He won over 81 million votes overall, or 51.3%. He defeated an incumbent president by a margin of 7 million votes. Still, Trump won over 74 million votes, or 46.8%. Polls consistently underestimated his support, although not by a huge margin. And while Biden comfortably defeated Trump by 306 votes to 232 in the Electoral College, it was built on a string of narrow victories across key battlegrounds. Indeed, all of the 3 exceptionally close states that were decided by less than 1% of the vote, Georgia, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, went to Biden. And most of the Notably close states, 1 to 5% went to Biden as well. And also some of the, or a few of the fairly close states, 5 to 10% went to Biden. The Cook Political Report's David Wasserman, or Wasserman, has noted that while Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 by 2.9 million votes and came within 77,744 votes of winning the presidency in 2016, Trump lost the popular vote in 2020 by 7.1 million votes and yet came within 65,009 votes of securing a majority in the Electoral College and with it a second term. That number is the combined total by which Biden defeated Trump in Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. Had all four gone the other way, Trump would have won the election with 270 electoral votes to Biden's 268. In other words, by the narrowest majority imaginable. Trump has refused to concede, even in the aftermath of the Electoral College tally that took place on December the 14th, 2020, when not a single presidential elector either abstained or voted for someone else, other than the candidate to whom he or she was pledged to vote for, or to give his or her vote. Trump has done far worse than declining to acknowledge Biden as the winner. No president of the United States has ever done what Trump has tried to do to change the results. His campaign team has filed at least 60 lawsuits, none of which have had any effect on either the popular vote, at least not in Trump's favor. In fact, the recounts have slightly increased Biden's popular vote margin, none of which have managed to overturn a single Electoral College result in Trump's favor, to change the results. While it is shocking, it is not surprising given the way he has operated in office, and I would say, given his egoist personality. So he always has to at least pretend that he has won. Even if he hasn't really. And he likes to surround himself with people who tell him what he likes to hear. So the defeated President Trump has spread the fiction that the election was stolen and has trafficked in conspiracy theories, the most bizarre of which claimed that Venezuela, a notorious socialist authoritarian dictatorship in South America, had something to do with rigging the election. Absolutely no basis in fact. That Biden's victory was based on widespread fraud across multiple states. This despite the fact that no serious or reliable or neutral election observer, whether an American one or an international one, has found any evidence, any provable evidence of such widespread fraud. If there was vote fraud, it was minor, and mostly we dealt with relatively small irregularities caused by clerical errors. And they have also already been explained and corrected. Trump has been rebuffed repeatedly by judges appointed by both Democrats and Republicans, including twice by a Supreme Court, 3 of whose justices he appointed during his term. So Trump's post-election campaign has been carried out in a way that undermines confidence in the integrity of the vote and potentially Biden's presidency. Trump has not been able to overturn the election, but the poisonousness or toxicity of his baseless repeated charges has leached into the body politic. Apparently, tens of millions of Trump's followers now believe that Biden was elected illegitimately, causing potentially significant damage to the electoral process and to Biden's ability to govern effectively. A recent Economist YouGov or GOV poll found that over 80% of Trump voters, at least of those who answered the poll, said Biden was not the legitimate winner of the election. Other polls have found roughly similar results. Many Democrats believed that the election would result in a more significant victory for their party and with it a clearer mandate. Instead, the opposite has occurred. A split decision that left the balance of power little changed, though not insignificantly with a new president. So the absence, or I would say the shortage of common ground. Democratic pollster Jeff Garin, spelled Garin, who has decades of experience measuring public attitude, said the election has left a divided country even more divided, adding that he cannot recall a time when there were fewer points of intersection or overlap between the two sides of the political divide, being Democrats and Republicans. Surveys both before and after the election underscore the dimensions of the gap that now separates those two worlds. A post-election survey by Public Opinion Strategies, a Republican firm, asked whether Republicans and Democrats have less respect for people in the other party than they did 4 years ago. 81% of Republicans and 77% of Democrats agreed. An October survey by the Public Religion Research Institute found that over 80% of self-identified Republicans said the Democratic Party had been taken over by socialists, while nearly 80% of self-identified Democrats said the Republican Party had been taken over by racists. The Pew Research Center found in October 2020 that 80% of Biden supporters and 77% of Trump supporters said they fundamentally disagree with the other side on core American values and goals. About 90% of both Trump's and Biden's supporters said there would be lasting harm to the country should the other party's candidate win. What this all reflects is the sense that the opposing party is pushing policies that are fundamentally going to do harm to the country, said Alan Abramowitz, a political scientist at Emory University, who has written extensively about polarization. Trump's presidency has expanded the values gap between the Republicans and Democrats, blacks and whites, those with college degrees and those without, those who attend church regularly and those who do not. Nothing that happened in November 2020 appears to have changed that in any significant way. Liliana Mason, a political scientist at the University of Maryland, whose specialty is the study of the partisan divisions in the United States, said that while she sees no sign that polarization is abating, she actually thinks that polarization is not as big of a problem anymore as democracy itself. Because in her view, Trump is really encouraging his supporters to believe in something that is not true, that is absolutely false, in that the election was rigged and therefore Biden did not deserve to win it. And that makes them really, really angry, which is extremely dangerous. Mark Mellman, a Democratic pollster, describes what has happened to separate the two Americas as a continuum that has turned what once was a ditch into a canyon and then the canyon into a chasm. Nothing about the cascading events of 2020, over 330,000 deaths, human deaths caused by the pandemic. Not the massive economic dislocations, including massive unemployment after a reasonably or notably low unemployment rate. Not the killings of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. Not Trump's stir-the-pot tweeting and attacks on rivals. Not an estimated $14 billion spent to sway voters. had much impact on how people voted. Bill McInturf, a Republican pollster, said his firm's analysis of the election concluded that this was the smallest number of ticket splitters since his firm began its measurement 2 decades ago. In 2006, voters weary of war and souring, meaning the US-Iraq War and its aftermath, souring, and of course the war on terror, souring on the leadership of then-President George W. Bush, gave Democrats the majority of the US House of Representatives. 2 years later, those same forces elected Senator Barack Obama as president. By the way, so far, the second last presidential candidate to win the majority of the popular vote in the United States. But however, in 2010, reaction to Obama's presidency, including the Obamacare legislation, produced a conservative Tea Party revolt, and Republicans regained the US House of Representatives. In 2014, they took control of the Senate. And then in 2016, the white working class voters helped Trump win the election, albeit narrowly. In 2018, white women with college degrees who were disgusted with Trump provided much of the energy that flipped the House to the Democrats. In 2020, with the stakes as high as ever and the country reeling from the coronavirus pandemic, racial protests, and economic losses, voters came out in force. Almost 160 million people voted in 2020, compared with about 138 million in 2016. However, they sent mixed signals with their ballots. In the US House of Representatives, Republicans captured almost all of the 27 races listed by the Cook Political Report as toss-ups. They also won 7 more seats that were listed as either likely or lean Democratic. In the Senate, 7 Republican seats were listed as toss-ups. Republicans won 5 of them, with the 2 Georgia races going to runoff elections. Democrats picked up only 2 Senate seats held by the Republicans after heading into the election day with the hope that they would emerge in the majority. Both parties have undergone dramatic changes over the past decade. Republicans are caught in the grip of Trump and Trumpism, while Democrats still are feeling the effects of gender, racial, generational, and ideological tensions, with rising constituencies demanding more representation and power and energy coming from the grassroots of the party. However, of course, it should be remembered that the United States has weathered many crises before. Many times the country could have broken apart, not the least in the Civil War, and it temporarily actually did, but it was then reunited, albeit through the painful adjustment period known as the Reconstruction, and then as a part of the price, the African American civil rights, including voting rights, were basically abolished in the southern states until the 1960s. But may God have mercy on the United States and the rest of the world.